Okay, so let's do a little workshop on unit testing specifically, sort of what we're looking for in your code bases. And I'm going to tie it all back to a talk that was given by the one and only Kent C. Dodds. His talk was based off of a tweet that went out that said something like this: write tests, not too many, mostly integration. So this was a famous or infamous tweet that went out a while ago that was accompanied by a really cool article in 2019. And I highly recommend you all taking a look at it, dropping that resource for you now. We want to find what they consider, right, our sweet spot in our code coverage, right? The code that we write being tested and backed by our unit tests, static analysis testing, and even integration tests, especially integration. So it's really weird to talk about unit tests and integration tests and not like disclaim that there is a very it's kind of a gray line between the two. When is it a unit test versus when is it an integration test? Those of you who may know the answer to that, why don't I ask that question to y'all in chat? So in our vibe check thread, we'll turn it into a QA thread. So QA here. Let me put an ampersand there. So what is the difference, or who can describe to me the differences or intricacies between a unit test and an integration test? And I'll give you some time to even Google this for the sake of, hey, if you don't know this question, let's set you off on a journey to start sort of understanding and unpacking this question. And to be honest, there's not one right answer. There's a variety of different answers to this that sort of help us describe and get to a conclusion here. But for intents and purposes of what we are doing in labs and what you're doing in software development, what are some of the differences or intricacies between unit tests and integration tests? Okay, so Lance says unit tests are more about ensuring single functions are doing what they're supposed to do, whereas integration tests are focused around ensuring more than one piece of your app are cooperating properly together. Perfect. Lance, that's a textbook example. I think if that would be like the first Googleable answer, and hopefully this is great. This knowledge is just soaking in. So what then are some real world examples of how integration tests and unit tests exists? So relating it back to the front end specifically, what are some examples of when you would have multiple functions interacting with one another that would require or would warrant the use of integration tests? Let's relate it to the front end first, and then we can talk about the back end.
I guess with like React, since functional components, they're technically a function, but they got a bunch of stuff going on inside of them. So when you're testing, like, is a functional component doing what it's supposed to, a lot of the tests on what you're doing aren't necessarily on the individual functions inside of it. It's more about am I getting the intended result that a user would like to see? And in general, that involves multiple functions, different API calls. So those are kind of integration tests, I guess, for the front end.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's good. Even further on that, because of the way that so if you can visualize how these functions all work together, and you can think of it like a tree structure, like the DOM, right? Because we're writing JavaScript, but it looks like HTML kind of in this JSX world, right? So you may have child components whose entire body or functionality rely on the data being passed to them by their parent component, right? In which case you would have two isolated components, but one that relies completely on its parent component to run and operate properly. In which case those two components would be integrated if you were to write a test to mount that child component, right? If you were to write a test to render out that child component, you would need to make sure that it is integrated properly with its parent components, and you could write that integration test to make sure that it does its thing the way that you expect it to do. Nathan extends this to unit tests, a single function, integration tests, components, small group of components. So like a grouping of these components on the front end for sure. What about on the back end? Where do we see integration tests take place on the back end? Now, this is something that I have not fully even considered trying to define yet. So I don't have a good answer, but I'm just like pontificating here. What about on the back end? Where do we find integration tests on the back end?
I mean, your endpoints are kind of a combination of model functions and middleware all happening at the same time. So if you're testing an endpoint, that is pretty much an integration test.
Beautiful. I mean, that's exactly how I would think of it and consider it as well. So great. Anyone want to add anything else to this dialogue about unit and integration? Okay, this it's fun to like write these articles and like share these blog posts and stuff. Let's see, there was something from, I actually am a little bit, yeah. So this one, Kent Dodds, who is the author of testingjavascript.com and has contributed heavily to the testing ecosystem and especially in JavaScript, right? He also now works for Remix. So if you're curious about a really cool new paradigm and framework, Remix is something that I highly recommend you jump into when you have leisure time. Again, I fully recognize that leisure time is not a thing. But Kent went and took that tweet and he made an entire conference talk and sort of a blog post about this. And he references back a lot of his other blog posts. So he references the original tweet by Guillermo Rauch, and then he goes back and starts talking about a bunch of other things. So I like to highlight what he says because basically my entire paradigm is based off of like this article. Up until this sort of thought came out, if you will, or this sort of paradigm came out, I was 100% on the train of, you know, testing as many things as you possibly can, getting as close to that 100% test coverage as you possibly can, meaning I want to test implementation details. I want to test the data that changes on state. So now I need to tap into state of my component to make sure that like that data is changing when I click a button, for example, it changes and toggles a Boolean. Where Kent Dodds would say, that's too much, that's implementation details. Your end users don't care about that. And testing that is wasting your time as a developer. So there's this thing that he talks about in diminishing returns. When you test too much, when you test all these details that the end user does not care about. The end user does not care about what is in your state or where your state lives, whether it be in the component or in a third-party object like a Redux store or something. So I love this article. It's very, very straightforward and to the point. And one of the best parts about it is you get cross links to all of the other stuff that like could build this foundation of you know, testing for you in your life. When you go and sit down in front of hiring managers and you have this conversation about testing, I would err on the side of adopting some of these opinions as sort of what we call industry standard, right? Not best practices, but good practices and what a lot of the big people are doing at big companies who are writing big software applications, okay? So before React Testing Library came out on the front end, we used a thing called Enzyme. Enzyme was, it came with an API that basically allowed you to sort of mount your components in this like shadow DOM area in like this little virtual DOM. Like it took the virtual DOM and it made it into its own little runtime, right? And then what it did is it gave you the ability to like tap in and highlight those implementation details. So a lot of us fell into those traps of testing too much. And again, I've shared this anecdote with y'all recently. The last job that I was at before BloomTech, I was required to write 100% test coverage for all the code that I delivered. We were in office one day a week, and in our little dev shop in our office, we had a giant dashboard, and it would show you all of your failed and successful CI/CD builds. So we had a CI/CD build that went and ran our code, and it would see if it failed those checks, much like the actions that you're seeing in your GitHub files, right? They'll go and run the linter, and then you could eventually run your tests and things like that. Then we would get a printout of all the failed tests that we'd get. So on Wednesdays, we would come into the shop and you would see my name in the column with a bunch of red X's next to it. And then that one final check mark that was like the merged PR, right? Just kind of how I worked. I would work in the open and I always push my code, but I'd always get sort of teased or whatever. My teammates would give me crap for like, oh, Ryan's always the renegade, always like pushing up his broken code or whatever. But it was silly because we were pushing for 100% test coverage, which most thought leaders today would say that you just get diminishing returns. So we were competing for like, winning prizes that didn't matter, if anything mattered. But usually it was just like who bought the manager lunch that day or whatever. So Kent goes on, he talks about all this stuff. But what does it all mean? He has this testing period of like base is unit, which is actually something where I prefer you focusing. Just getting really good at writing unit tests is going to impress your hiring managers. When you sit down and you have this conversation, like I was mentioning, when you have an opinion about it, when you have shown that you know what you're talking about in the testing realm, your street cred, quote unquote, goes up. Your hireability score, if there is such a thing, just completely skyrockets. The more you can sort of talk technically about testing and form an opinion about it and have those conversations. These are the questions that I would write down right now that I would recommend you start asking your hiring managers. How do you see the value of automated tests at this job, right? That's a really, really good informed question. And then if those values align with your personal value, then that's great. That just shows you that you've found yourself a really awesome place that's probably going to be very fulfilling a job for you. Do you care about 100% test coverage? That's also like a good open question. It's like, yes, and here's why, or no, here's why not. Here's what we actually care about. These types of things, and it will help you come across as somebody who just like cares deeply and wants to ship code with confidence. It's one thing to just write a bunch of code and like push features, but it's another to push those features out to end users, having confidence behind that code that you write. And the higher up you get up this testing pyramid, the more confidence that you have. And I would also argue that, let me get my little annotator out. I would also argue that the size of your company, the size of your code base will roughly depend where you sort of fall on this spectrum. Are you like a small little startup? You can't really afford to be all the way up here and happy knowing that you have some sort of integration end-to-end, some sort of end-to-end testing suite running, right? These things are not only costly with money, but time costly, which is money in general. And so if you are a Zillow, or if you are an Airbnb, again, I don't know why these are my examples that keep coming back to me. If you are like a giant brokerage or something, or some sort of like Amazon, a shopping cart, right? You're probably going to make sure that all of your code is end-to-end tested all the way up here, this level of confidence, meaning you have robots who virtually go and click buttons and test your software as an end user, click around on your site, right? I think that 99%, well, these look like G's, I know, 99% of companies out there should really focus here. Get to a good, solid understanding of how all of your intricate pieces work together, and then test them there. And it would require that you have a good, firm base of unit tests. Okay. So this is my opinion. Again, it's very similar to what you would hear Kent Dodds or others in the space say. I'm right there. It's like most companies don't need end-to-end testing suite unless they have, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users, millions of users working and operating with their software over and over again. Okay. The best part about this article, I think, oh, this is funny. I pulled this up too. So this is, I think some of you might have seen this. So expect umbrella opens to be true, right? So that's the unit test. And let's see how the test works. So we passed the unit test, right? Like we got it. The umbrella definitely opens. So I loved this. I thought that was really, really clever. Anyway, so this is what I think is the most helpful, is this piece right here, how to write more integration tests, right? And then it has to do with implementation details. So the age-old question is, what do we test? What do we care about? And I'm going to actually pull up our front end. And I think there's still some components there that aren't tested, that we could actually write some tests live together, and you guys could drive me through it. I think it'd be a really fun exercise. So right here down at the bottom. Okay, read this article. Let me go ahead. Testing implementation details, what to test versus what not to. This is where I gleaned the most from virtually like this conversation. So how do you avoid testing implementation details? It's like, I don't want to fall into this trap of testing things that I really shouldn't care about, that maybe I want to care about, but let's get this really good example here. So the first thing is to sort of figure out what part of your untested code base would be really bad if it's broken. And in this case, the checkout process is really bad. Like obviously, if the user can't check out, they can't do anything. So try to narrow it down to a unit test, or to a unit or a few units of code. So what is that thing that you can actually test to test the checkout sequence? Well, the user is clicking checkout and a request with the cart items is sent to checkout. Think about that for a second. That's two different things. The function fires when the user clicks the button, and then it fires with the data, right? Or it fires to a request to checkout. We don't really care about that data. The data we can test on the back end, right? So for front end sake, user clicks a button. That's one thing to test, that it clicks. We can check that, and that it also calls the proper area, right? It calls the checkout route with the cart items sent. So maybe we do care about cart items. Let's find out. And then look at the code and consider who the users are: the developer rendering the checkout form, and the end user clicking the button, right? Cool. Now write down a list of instructions for that user to manually test that code to make sure it's not broken. So this is how I want you to approach these features that are on the DOM. Break it down by saying, what are the units of code that need to be tested to make this thing work, right? And then write out the instructions for what you would want your test to do. So render the form with some fake data in the cart, okay? Click the checkout button. Ensure that the mocked checkout API was called with the right data. So we actually do care about the right data in this case for sure. Respond with fake successful response. Make sure the success message is displayed. Okay. We didn't even talk about this. This was just something that was, I guess, innately here. So we didn't even talk about the final step, which would be, hey, this worked and the user needs to know that it worked. Some sort of success message or something. And then you can turn that, once you have a list of that little algorithm, that step-by-step, idea to get your test put together, we can turn that list of instructions into an automated test. Okay. So I think this is the best way to think about your components. Now, again, if you were thinking about a child component that requires some data to be rendered for that will be rendered by the parent, then you can follow these steps. And of course, by following this, you have crafted an integration test, right? Knowing that your components are integrated one with another and working as expected. Again, about the back end, you have a route that has a handler and some middleware that all need to be sort of put together, and they need to function properly. And it's based on a model, right? So you can mock away all that database. You could set up a test database. I prefer to mock it away, but I know a lot of people are setting up test database to use that as a mocking sequence to test your model as well. Testing all those things in isolation is great, but when you get to that route level, you need them to all be integrated and working well together, especially with your backend, with your middleware models and any other like route handlers that you have. Okay. Has anyone garnered any questions during the last few minutes that I've been talking about this?
I have kind of a general question.
Go ahead.
When we're looking through this, it's kind of breaking it down into, I guess, what would be unit tests, like render the form with some fake data, click the checkout button. Those would be little individual tests. Is I guess like the testing suite composing all of those would be the integration test?
Yeah, so in this case, it's going to be a little bit difficult to really figure out an integration test for this one singular action, right? Because our form doesn't at this point necessarily rely on a parent component to mount that form, right? The way that we've sort of written this out, this would be for a unit test, right? But let's say that a form's a hard example because, yeah, let's say that there is a modal that comes up with a select box, right? And maybe it's like on that form, it's like you can go down a deeper path of like gathering more data. Let me think about that for a second, because there's not really a good real world example in a shopping cart that I can think of that would require integration tests. And it's kind of a stretch to think about it, but think of that. Think of like a deeper checkout funnel, for example, where the user has to like pop open a modal. And now that modal whose parent was that form is going to rely on the data or some interactions with that form, for example. And so you would click that button and it would show up on the screen. Now you can test that that's on the screen and that the form is on the screen, and that's an integration test in that case. It's a totally convoluted example, and I understand that's not real world because like a shopping cart experience is like multi-selects, a form, toggles, right? You select the right thing, the size, the variant of the product, and then you hit checkout, right? We care about mocking all of that stuff away. Anything that the user did prior to checking out, we would create our own JavaScript object with the proper fields to then send off to the endpoint, right? And so, and you would hope that you're testing those little individual bits together. So let's say that in this case, you would have a whole bunch of unit tests in your suite for the entire form. They would all be unit tests making a suite of unit tests that give you confidence to back that form. Where something like that would be integrated, I'm struggling to come up with a really good example other than that like convoluted modal example. So
thank you.
Yeah. In other worlds, I mean, you definitely get this pattern of child and parent components in React, and then the integration of a route needing the model and the middleware to operate fully. Again, when you're testing that thing in isolation, you mock those things away. So you can do that again by creating your own test database that you mount and dismount. You before each, after each, you instantiate and clean up, or before all, you instantiate a new database and then you populate it with some mock data and then test that. But what do you really care about in this scenario? You care about that the proper data was sent on click and that your response is a 200, right? You want, and based on a 200, you show a message to the user that everything worked, right? Based on the steps that were broken out here. So it's so hard to like teach testing. I empathize a lot with Kent in this regard because it's so hard to come up with really good, solid like testing examples. His, by the way, if you have some time, so a little bit of cash as well, this course changed everything for me. The testingjavascript.com course is unbelievable. It's pricey to get the pro one. What I would do is I would talk to the people who hire you and talk about education benefits, extended learning benefits. And if you really want to get started with this, you could get the cheaper version of it for right now. Again, team discounts, stuff like that. Maybe you convince your boss to go through it. But Kent, even just his free blogs and articles about it, really set the tone for where I think we want to be. Sorry, big tangent there. I'm sorry about that. Any other questions or comments before we dive into the code? Okay. All right. So more or less you could follow along because you have front end or back end repos where you could kind of look at this stuff. We're going to take a look at the front end now, just real quick, and just see some examples of stuff that I have written in our code base. Let me see here really quick. There was something this, I thought I got rid of all these. It's sad that's still there. I thought I got rid of like that. Let's see. This one. Oh, we're good. Okay, cool. I need an env file. So for this to work, I'm going to copy this. Paste in those boilerplate example URIs and stuff. And let's go ahead and just run our terminal. I'll run it in a different command. So we'll just do npmi. I'm gonna open a window because it's already hot. $25 outside. And I have to open a window in this south-facing office because it's not insulated, and the heat just comes in even in the middle of winter. Okay, so what we're going to look at here is sort of how I set things up. Now, I like to put all of my tests in a testing directory. So that way I know exactly where to go when I want to write tests for my stuff. I just put everything in there. And it's like I don't have subfolders or directories or anything, and that's how I configured it. And then if you look at how so to set up testing, you'll have this little setup tests.js file, which will be read at some point by your configuration, which will allow us to use our extended expect, gives us more functionality out of Jest for the front end. And then some prop type error. So that's very, very React specific. And then just like kind of mocking the canvas, etc. I don't really know actually what that's used for, but it was required. And then if you look at Jest, how it's configured, we just have this, we're just putting this on Windows. So on the JavaScript object, it looks like we're defining a property called backing store pixel ratio, and the value of that's going to be this little thing. So just, I guess it's for that. This again came with sort of the config of what we built. So couldn't really dive into the necessity of it at this point. And maybe it's not even necessary anymore because it was 2 years ago now that I've written this code. So that's fun. And then we have, okay, so that's pretty much it. Just config and we're good to go. Now, if we look at our package lock, I have supplied a couple of commands. So if I go npm run test, it's going to go, and it's actually going to use Craco to test. That's kind of fun because it needs to do that Craco environment. I don't know if that's necessary though. We'll see. And then this is a big one too. How many of you have, just by show of like Zoom hand raise, how many of you have done npm run coverage yet in your code coverage? Have you checked out your coverage report? Not very many. A couple of thumbs downs. Okay, let's see what it says. So if I go now and so I could go fix all those, but I don't need to. npm run coverage. I don't have to have a server running. This will go and it'll do its own thing. It's going to go and run my test suite. And with the coverage argument, it's going to actually go and build out a coverage report. So this is going to go and run all of my tests that are in here. Looks like they all passed, much like that umbrella from earlier. And it's going to give you this really cool log of what you have written in your code base and how much of it is backed by unit tests. So a good way to read this. There's 50% of my statements in JavaScript and or JSX, since that's the code that we care about, that are covered. So right now I'm at about a 50% code test coverage in my code base. If I was at the previous company that I was at before Lambda or BloomTech, I would have not been able to push any of this code to production, right? Because it was required that I had 100% of my code covered. Okay. Do I have confidence in this scaffolding tool that I've built for you all, that the team and I put together a couple of years ago? I'd say that after 2 years of relatively no maintenance at all, almost like very few instances of pushing, updating a few things here and there. I would say that I'm pretty confident that y'all can take this and run with it and build software with it. So that's like the achievable thing. All of it's done with like examples and stuff like that. So yeah, this is your code coverage report. We used to have a command that would go into that would go with your CI/CD build, with your GitHub Actions, that would go and actually run this, and it would print this score out, and it would give us a little badge. And that badge we could put in your product readmes and see how much of your code was covered by tests right there in the readme, which was really neat. It would just go and do that when it would build for us automatically. We used a tool called Code Climate and Sonar Cloud to achieve those. It would print out this sort of XML, this sort of table comes out in XML, and it would read how many lines of code are tested. So, but yeah, now we have a couple of things. There's a couple of components that are completely untested that I think would be fun to test, that I think would be fun to look at. And this, as well as a couple of these, we could see if I care about these or not. And then we don't care about like your theme overrides. It's just a JavaScript object that's being exported. So let's go and actually look at one of these components and start testing it. What do you say? Sounds like a good idea. Okay. So first off, let's look at how I've done this, because every time I jump back into testing, I have to refresh my memory on like how we've done a lot of stuff. A lot of things that we are using here come directly from React Testing Library. Render, act, and cleanup. Act helps you work with asynchronous functions. Cleanup does what it says. It'll clean up sort of the environment you're using to test, etc. And then render will allow us to sort of mock render out our components. So every single time we are calling this after each function here in these tests, we're mocking away our API because I don't care about the implementation details of that API. So this is, again, the example list. So we need to, again, we need to look at the example data viz container component and the render data viz component itself. But now that I kind of can see what we would do here with this type of stuff, let's go now to those other functions, those other components. So the other components are going to be found in pages. Here is the first one. And then render data viz, it's been so long since I've seen these, is the next one. All right, so let me get my bearings here. We are using Octa-Auth, which means that if this component wants to mount, or if we try to render this component, it is going to be dependent on Octa-Auth as well. So we have to mock that away, which is kind of a pain. And I'll show you what to do with that in just a second. And we have a form that gets mounted. So what we're going to care about is there a form? I should probably put some sort of ID on this, and I probably don't need this fragment here now that I'm looking at this component. I should probably put some sort of ID that'll allow me to grab this form. But worst comes to worst, maybe I don't care necessarily about the form itself. Maybe I care about the select button. Now, select from Ant Design is actually really weird to test. A lot of these, you're going to have to look up examples on Stack Overflow of how people have done this and how they have grabbed selectors to make sure that thing is on the DOM. So we care that this select is on the DOM and that it has an appropriate amount of options to select from. The options are going to be on state, and Alabama is going to be selected. So what this little component does, maybe I'll be, I don't even know if the backend's working for this anymore. It would be actually a miracle if it was. Yeah, no, I'm 100% certain that's taken down. So the backend doesn't even work for this, so we can't get like the component, but this will go and it's actually going to mount a React App URI, API URI plus data viz state code. Okay, so it's so the state code will be like it would be like AL. Is that Alabama or Alaska? I can't remember. Alabama probably. AL. There's Utah, Colorado, right? New Mexico. That's the state code. So these options are one of those things. So what this did is it gave you an unemployment rate graph based on the state. So you could go and look at the unemployment rate values kind of rise and fall. And it was like through COVID, it was kind of a fun little app that Ryan Herr built back in the day. And that was the DS API that was built. And now the front end is consuming it. So it's actually going to mount a Plotly data viz, which I am not going to test for intents and purposes of that would just take me too long to figure out how to test that. I would have to look up a lot of examples. But one thing we are going to care about on this component is, can the user operate with the select function? And and what happens when they click this change handler, when they change something else, and then what happens then to that data to then be submitted. Yeah, because then it would go here. Let me just see this really quick. I know what was happening. Okay, so when this would get updated, state would change, which means props would change, which means data would change, right? Or the props here, what did we care about? Props. I'll say props.url. Okay. And props dot, what else do we care about? So yeah, this would be a really good example if I could test this with integration tests. And then notice all this initial state that we have to give to Plotly to do its thing. Yeah, really, that's just going to be set, and data is going to come from data.data, which will be set on here after this runs with the props URL, which is going to be this. So that gets sent off, and we fetch all of this from Plotly, and they give us back the data, which we can then mount to this Plotly component. Okay. Let me just visualize that for y'all. So imagine a graph. Come on, imagine a graph. Oh my gosh, why is it doing this? I'm asking to draw. Okay. All right. So imagine a graph on the page and then a state. So let's say it's Arizona. And basically this is what the user can change, right? There's a little select bar somewhere that allows you to pick. And I wish that I could actually mount this, but again, our API is just not. It's not up and running anymore. So you pick your state, so you can select Arizona, which would then get you the data and render some sort of chart of unemployment rates that hopefully went like this through the recession or through COVID, and now are maybe up here. I don't know. I have no clue what unemployment's been looking like recently. But this is kind of what this would do. That's what this whole feature would do. And it was an example that we provided in the code base of a cross-functional effort between data science and web, and how you could sort of go about integrating with the two with Plotly. We wanted to make sure learners, we used Plotly a lot back in the day with some of our early stakeholders in Bloom Tech Labs. And so because of that, we wanted to make sure learners had an example of Plotly and how to see it from the scaffolding so they could go and use it. By the way, side note to all of this, please go and remove any of the stuff that's like example, right? In your code base, you don't need examples in there anymore. If you're not using any of this stuff, get rid of it all in your code bases. Okay, clean it up, get rid of the tests that are associated with those things, etc. Okay. All right. We now need to look at our example data viz. So we're going to say example data viz container.test.js. Okay, and just like here, we definitely need React, and we're going to need some of these things. So this is, I mean, a lot of tests, a lot of it's just kind of boilerplate, right? And then we need to import in our example. What did we call it? It's called example data viz container.js. So let's go back out into components. I didn't want to autocomplete. Into pages, into example data viz, into example data viz container. Okay, so now we have the component that we can work with. And what I'll do is I'll close that, but I'll open, let's see, I want to save this. And we want to keep this one open. So open, what I can do is just go like
I'm in
this.
class. I gotta turn my Zoom down 1 sec.
Oops, you unmuted while you did that as well, bud. It happens to the best of us. Okay, and then there, and here. Okay, so again, we're not going to get probably down to this level. So let me ask you now the questions that Kent Dodds proposed. So what would be really bad if this broke? Well, it would be bad if if that thing is not mounted to the screen, right? So the user can't even select a country, right? That's what we care about in this particular unit test. They can select a country, and then when they select that country, it fires off a request, right? Which we're going to have to play around with. The weird thing is though, is that test is not in our API, so we can't even mock it out. Let me double check that. What else do we care about? Is there anything else we should consider here? Oh, we have a get example data. Yeah, we can import this and mock it out. So we're gonna mock this out too. Get example data from API. Okay, we're gonna mock, whoops. We're gonna mock that away as well. So we need to pull in jest to do some mocking. Let me look at something that has jest in it. Okay, jest.mock. So we'll pull in, we just use jest and we say jest.mock out our API, get example data. Wait, is this get example data from, sorry, I need to figure out where this gets invoked from. Because if it's not from the data science example, then it's the wrong API handler. I think what happens, it's being recorded right now. I think what happens is this is our get DS data. That's the one we need. So get DS data. And let's go over there and take a peek at it real quick. So get DS data takes in a URL and it takes in some auth state, which would be whether or not the user was authenticated, which would then call this function. So talk about integration, because we've componentized and modularized all of our little function calls, our helpers here. This needs to work in order for this to work, right? So this function has to work with an auth state. So we just need to pass, I think we just end up passing a Boolean to it, because props.auth state, oh no, we pass a whole object to it. So this is actually going to be way more complicated to think about than I thought. So we pass a whole object, which comes from auth state in the browser, and we can take a look at what that looks like and mock that away. And then we pass this URL, and we need to make sure those two things are mocked. So I need to go back here and let me see that example. Now that I have all the pieces together, this just function. And actually this just, all we can do is do that. And then we don't even need to worry about the arguments to pass to it, which are fine. Because the URL itself will be the thing that this component cares about eventually. And we're not testing that. We care that the user can test it and that the function fires. So we need to mock that away. So let me pull this side by side so I remember exactly how to mock, or you could just go straight to Jest's documentation, and they have great documentation. So we can call Jest and we can say mock. Don't want to do that. Why is that happening? Jest.mock, and then we're going to say we can mock out our entire API here, which is cool because then we don't even need to bring this in. Okay, cool. So mock out our API, and the callback that you pass to mock is where you can sort of build out your little mocked environment. So it's called get DS data. And we would say jest.function. And then we just want that to resolve. So be a function that resolves a promise with some empty state data. So promise.resolve, and we'll just resolve an empty array for now. If there's anything that we need further, we can do that. So is there anyone who wants to potentially unmute and describe, just like, tell me what it was that I just did here? What did I do to our function call?
I think it's just like any call that uses that specific resource is going to be intercepted by Jest and mocked, and then you've added the get DS data method to that. So that actually will always say promise resolved and turn into empty array.
Beautiful. Why did I do that? Why not just pull in my function call to the API and invoke it straight from my test? Let me give you an example. What if you were to write a test that invoked a user, like an email out to your end users, it invoked your email API, and you were testing an invalid payment, an expired credit card? What is that end user actually going to get in their inbox? They're going to get an email that says that their credit card now is invalid when it's actually not, right? Because you were testing and you were kind of building this mock environment. And you actually hit the actual endpoint and failed that test on behalf of that user, or failed that function on behalf of the user, right? So this is why we mock things away. We don't want to invoke truly our API from our test. Our test suite should never do two things. It should never directly call our API without having some sort of mock or super test request handler or capital R request from Jest Express, right? And it should never interface with live data, right? It should always be mocked away or a test database. Okay, so this is going to be an API request that we send up to a live API that's actually broken right now, but the end user doesn't care about that yet. We care about whether our functionality can work in our testing suite for them being able to click and call the API. So we're going to mock away that, and we're just going to say, hey, if this component invokes or calls DS data somehow, then go ahead and make sure that it's mocked away and that we're not doing it. But now that we're doing that, we're going to run into problems with our other test suite, which is why we're going to say after each of these run, go ahead and clear, clear the mocks. So that way there's nothing dirty. So we're going to call that cleanup function. And we're going to say jest.clear all mocks. Okay, cool. Now we can actually test, now that we've kind of like worried about some things. So we're going to go with the describe block, and we want to describe the example data viz. Example data viz container testing suite. Okay, that's what I did for the other one too. Cool. So I'm keeping my uniformity. This is something that I would do on a normal basis. Now I can actually write my tests. Test that something happens. And these autocompletes are going to be the bane of my existence. So we want to test that the container mounts a select, an ant-d select component, right? Select component with state selections or state options. Okay, now we have our little runtime for our test. Okay, and of course, these after each, they can be, it might be more beneficial to do something like this inside of here if you want, but I sometimes just keep them global. And this turned into a kind of a disaster with my, it just got the too many lines and now it doesn't look very nice, but oh well. Here we are. Okay, what's next? Oh, hold on. I know what the problem is here. Oh yeah, no, it's fine. It just looks ugly. Okay, now we need to kind of figure out what we care about, right? When we need to figure out, we need to actually render out the component and see what breaks. That's my favorite thing to do with React, is to render out our component first. So let's go and let's just see what happens when we call render and we say example data viz container.
I think you have an extra callback because I think the first parameter of describe is actually the message, right? And then the second one is the.
Oh, is that what happened? Okay, yeah. So it should look like this with this, and then this can go away because we have this.
Yeah.
And hopefully that fixes it. Genius. Thank you for the eyes. Sometimes when you look at your own code for a second, it's weird. Okay, so we're going to render it out and we're going to see what happens when we render. Notice that we're using some await stuff here. The act it may call for this, but let's see what happens when we go through it. So let's go ahead and run our npm test. Let's see if that works. Yeah, it's going to go and run the test coverage. And we just cared about it running our particular test. We didn't care about it running all of our tests, right? So, so now here's a problem. Who knows my problem? That's not in my code. That's not in my example data viz code. Problem is we're trying to mount a child component, right? That requires the use of Plotly in this. So that would mean that we need to figure out how to make sure that Plotly is defined. And I think all we need to do is just import it into our test from React Plotly. And maybe the hard thing is this is in our child test. So I don't know if that's going to actually fix it. No, it doesn't like that because the child container needs to see it. Okay, this is okay. So how would we go about making sure this works? We would need to make sure that we are, so let's see. This is our component and it mounts this component. Okay. But we don't care about this component yet. We care about that later. And whether or not auth state is sent to it, same with URL. So what do? How do we make this into an integration test? It has to be an integration test because this one, it will mount alongside this, not necessarily mount, but it will get ran and processed this alongside this one, right? So what do we have to do here? Who wants to walk me through it? I have a pretty good idea of what I would do, what my approach would be. Since we're up close to the hour, I would actually write it out and wrap that component by pulling it in. And then you could probably pull it in from the other way. And no, because Plotly, yeah, we didn't delete it yet. Import Plotly from React plotly.js. Still doesn't like it. Or import plot. Because this will be a component that will get mounted on the other one. So this is going to be a live API, right? This is going to be a live thing. So we have to actually figure, and this isn't even a component yet. So this is where things get really hairy, because now we need to actually go and make sure that we're testing render data viz at some point with a unit test. And we need to make sure that it works together with the proper things that we need to send to it, like this stuff. So we would actually mock it out and send it with this object, whatever it needs to be, and some sort of URL to make it mount. But we also need to make sure that it has access to that plot. So to be able to do that, I would have to start Googling. This is a point where it's like, okay, how would I make sure all these things get run together if plot is going to be a child component? So React testing. So what I would Google now is just React testing plot as a child component. How do I test that a child component is rendered? I don't care about that. Plot, and we're going to say plotly.js. Draw a new plot from div, function reference JavaScript error while plotting after React update, React plotly.js editor. Let's do this. React testing library and plotly.js child. Yeah, somebody wrote that. Okay, plotly error when running just for test. Let's see what this says. Yeah, this is it, or something similar. Ours says type error window.create object URL is not a function. So I ended up unmocking the plotly library, warning it makes the test run extremely slow since it's now actually rendering. Bonus overriding component props. So we could unmock plotly, but that's plotly.js. We care about plotly React.js. So this is where it's funny because this is how I would figure this whole thing out, just to get confidence in the things that I care about. Right now, we can't mock this away quite yet until we really know what we need to do, right? And it renders its own child component itself. So we would have to write an entire integration test that goes from top to bottom to make sure that this thing sets up. And now I'm remembering why I didn't include this test in the first place with the examples, because it's really, really convoluted. But now what I want to do, and we're at the top of the hour, we're over time. I'll leave you to go out and start thinking about this type of stuff. Like what was it that my process got us to this point? And then when I have some free time later this afternoon, or maybe tomorrow or later this week, I'll actually flesh out the rest of this I'll record it for you, and I'll drop the async video for you all to kind of witness, now that you have like a good understanding of like how I got to at least this point, or hopefully you've seen some important things. The important things to know is that you can mock away your API call, so you're not actually mocking it away. And now I need to do something very similar with with Plotly in order to mount this child component. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get to the state that we want to be able to test it. Just that the thing interacts with the DOM the way that we want the users to be able to interact with it. Okay. So write tests, not too many, mostly integration. I think that's the best place to sort of concern yourself with. And then I'll finish this conversation with an asynchronous video that I can publish this week. I can throw it in Slack to hopefully like get us to a total finish line. I wish we were able to get there. I think we're probably about a half an hour away from like getting to what we want to get to. So, and hopefully you've seen somebody who's done this for many years struggle through it. It's not second nature. If anyone is saying that testing is second nature, it's because they are an automated test engineer or they do this all the time, right? It's second nature when you're working at a big company and you're just writing tests all the time. And then there's just little tricks that you pick up along the way where it's like, I know how to test this to get the confidence that I want out of it, right? That confidence is always about, can the user click on this button? Can they do this thing? And it's giving them the proper steps to do the next thing. So If you have any other questions or anything, just feel free to DM me or reach out. Again, I'm excited to now test through this and kind of unravel this puzzle and see if I can't get a solid test that I care about for this with a good example. So for now, we'll leave it here and we'll see you the next time we see you.